Okay. That's a draft record for Treliving. I don't want to spend too much time just going through his history, but I just wanted to bring up 3 trades, and I want you to tell me whose side you were on for this trade when it happened, and now that hindsight is 2020, looking back on the trade, whose side you are on now. So the first one I wanted to mention is the most recent blockbuster trade that Brad Treliving made, and that was, of course, the Tkachuk trade, where he sent Tkachuk in a 4th and got Huberdeau, Weegar, Cole Schwindt, and a 1st. So what were your thoughts on that trade when it happened, and what are your thoughts now?
Yeah, well, that one I think is a great place to start because my thoughts are very different. At the time, obviously Matthew Tkachuk, great player, 100-point player, but you get in return a 115-point player. You get in return top 2 defensemen. I won't get into the prospects and the picks, but essentially, you're trading a 100-point guy for a 115-point guy who's coming off a great season. Was he nominated for the Hart? I believe
I think he was. Well, he set the record.
He was certainly in that realm.
Yeah, he set the record that year for most assists as a left winger in NHL history.
Yeah, I can't remember if he actually got a top 3 nomination, but regardless, he was in that conversation. Mackenzie Weegar, obviously, we discussed him as well. So I was very much on the side of Calgary. I thought Florida overpaid a little bit. And then of course both sides give out the contracts that they did, or I guess in terms of Florida it was assume a sign and trade. I thought it was a great return for Brad Treliving, especially under the pressure that he was.
Yes.
So a ton of credit to him there. Unfortunately, we know how the first season played out. Did not work out at all for Calgary this year. They've got 8 more years of Huberdeau at 10-5 to look forward to. Hopefully he turns it around. I mean, I wouldn't bank on Jonathan Huberdeau being a 55 or 56 point player next year. I think there's a rebound. Is he a 115 point player? I don't know. He's probably somewhere in the middle, closer to 100 points. But I would be more confident in his ability to rebound. But regardless, didn't work out this year. Mackenzie Weegar is okay. It was fine. But I think can be better. And Matthew Tkachuk, another 100-point season. He was the heart and soul of that team through the regular season. Heart and soul of that team right now. Of course, this conversation may be very different if Florida doesn't get into the playoffs, which they were close to not doing. But the fact that they are where they are in the Stanley Cup final, it's through 1 year, it's pretty obvious who the winner is. But at the time, you don't have the benefit of hindsight. So again, I'll give Brad Treliving a ton of credit for not just doing something bold, but doing something bold under pressure.
So I think the context really matters. You mentioned a couple times under pressure. You're referring to the fact that Matthew Tkachuk asked to be traded out of Calgary, which is the same thing that happened with Dougie Hamilton, asked to be traded out of Calgary, and Adam Fox as well, which is the next trade I wanted to get into. But just quickly on the Huberdeau and Tkachuk trade, I mentioned this a couple weeks ago on the podcast that I thought, at the time, I thought Calgary won that trade. They got deeper and, they maintained some of the offense, in swapping Huberdeau for Tkachuk. Like, you actually brought in more offense, or at least it seemed that way at the time. I kind of just chalk it up to coaching. Like, at times Huberdeau was playing on the third line, and it seems like no one wanted to play for Daryl Sutter. So I'm going to chalk it up to that and expect both of those players to bounce back next year. But we'll see how it turns out. As of right now, I don't think it's a colossal win or loss either way. I think we'll have to see how the contracts play out. And
it's such a long-term thing with long-term commitment from both sides. You can't declare a winner or a loser after 1 year. As any GM will tell you, hopefully both sides win, and everybody has a good career and everybody benefits. But the playoff run is obviously made it pretty lopsided. But I agree.
I mean, they got in by a point, so I think Calgary might have had one more point than them.
Yeah, that's right. Calgary finished in the total league standings. Calgary finished ahead of Florida. Florida was the 17th place team this year.
Yeah,
which is crazy.
That is crazy. Yeah, that's two. this is a Leafs podcast, so we can talk about this kind of stuff. That's 2 teams who finished outside of the top 16 in league standings who have beat the Leafs in the playoffs. Montreal was the first team, and then Florida, of course, this year. So I don't know what it is, man. I just can't get over the hump. But okay, back to Treliving. We're talking about these trades because obviously there's a problem right now in Toronto, and everybody's pointing to the core 4, and then they look at Treliving and say, hey, look, like, this is a guy who's been able to pull off some big moves with some big name players, and so they're wondering if something like that is going to happen in Toronto. No, I don't know if I would go that far. We don't really know what's going on with the core 4 yet. We're going to talk about that. But that trade wasn't the only time he had done that, so I want to go to 2 more trades. I guess we can talk about these next 2 together at the same time because they're both the Dougie Hamilton trade, just different times. So originally, Brad Treliving and the Flames got Dougie Hamilton from Boston, who I believe requested a trade out of Boston. I don't think he fit in very well there. I know that he wasn't.
He's moved around a bit.
Yeah, he's bounced around. There's something there. I know you've shared this with me before, but he's a hell of a defenseman. So they paid a first and 2 seconds to get him. And then later, Brad Treliving and the Flames traded Michael Furland, Dougie Hamilton, Adam Fox, for Elias Lindholm and Noah Hannafin. Now, that trade, at the time when it happened, I looked at it from Carolina's perspective, and I thought, okay, they fleeced the Flames, because not only did they get Hamilton, who became the cornerstone of their defense, for the next however many years until he needed a new deal, but they got Adam Fox too. The problem with that is they weren't able to keep him. They had to trade him for pennies on the dollar. I think it was his wife was working in New York, and so he wanted to play in New York. He was a college free agent.
That might be Trouba.
Oh, was that Trouba?
I think it was Trouba, but regardless, he wanted to be in New York.
I don't know exactly the reason. It might have been the wife thing. It might not have been. But end of the day, he wanted to play in New York. He didn't want to play in Carolina or Calgary. So even though Carolina acquired him, they had to flip him for pennies on the dollar. So it really wasn't that big of a win. Plus then as well, like Dougie Hamilton, they let walk for nothing.
Yeah.
So at the time, I thought Carolina won the trade. But now looking back at it, I see a guy in Lindholm who has developed into a really nice two-way center for that team. Like a guy who gets Selke votes every year now. Not top 3, but he's there in the Selke conversation at least every year because he's a good defensive forward. And then Hannafin, a good defenseman, steady guy on the back end. So, what do you think of that trade? What did you think at the time, and what do you think now looking back on it?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to agree with you so much. It's not very compelling podcasting, but yeah, I would agree at the time. Carolina gets a number 1 defenseman in Dougie Hamilton. Adam Fox, of course, at the time is a prospect, but a highly touted prospect.
Yes.
Lindholm looked like a guy. I'm skipping Michael Furland, but no disrespect to him. I guess I will say about him, he's a heavy player. Looked like a good bottom 6 guy at the time.
Yep.
But Lindholm looked like a guy who needed a change of scenery. He was fine, but he did not look like the guy that he's become, and had been in Carolina for a few years, and just wasn't taking that step forward. And Noah Hannafin, I think everybody recognized his upside. I would say it wasn't a sure thing that he would reach the heights of where Dougie Hamilton was at, in terms of being that number 1 defenseman. He has, I think, stepped into that role. He I don't know if he's a bona fide number 1, but regardless, he's been tasked with that role. He looks like a top 2 guy, in my opinion. But at the time, I thought here's a really, really strong return for Carolina, shore up the back end, and we'll see how these younger guys continue to develop in Calgary. But as things do, things move around. Those 2 pieces are still in Calgary and have become very important pieces in Hannafin and Lindholm. None of those guys, all 3 of those guys, are no longer in Carolina. So just based on that, it looks like a win for the Flames. Assuming everybody stayed put, you've got 2 number 1 defensemen in that trade. Assuming that Adam Fox's development path would be the same had he not been in New York. But yeah, at the time I would say probably a slight win for Carolina. And then, in terms of the other trade, the first and 2 seconds for Dougie Hamilton from Boston. It's expensive to get number 1 defenseman in this league. The Leafs know that, I'm sure. Brad Treliving certainly knows that from paying that price. I would love if we knew who exactly those picks turned into, but
so off the top of my head, I know that one of them was one of the first rounders in 2015 when Boston had 3.
Right.
So it was one was Zach Senyshyn.
Okay.
Which of course Zach hasn't turned out to be a full-time NHL player, but great guy, friend of the show. But yeah, so that was one of them. I don't know about the 2 seconds, but just from my quick research, nothing jumped off the page to me. I'd have to take a quick look.
But regardless, you have a chance to get a number 1 D to change the look and the feel of your team by inserting a player of that caliber. The reasons for Hamilton moving around so much, I don't know. I can't speak to. He's still, a great player in New Jersey and is playing huge, or has been playing huge minutes there. Of course, they're not in it anymore. But yeah, it's notwithstanding the high cost, it's hard to say no to a deal like that, especially where you're, if you're in a position where you believe you can contend, you're looking for those types of deals where you don't have to give up an active player on your roster.
Yes.
You want to add. You just want to continue to add, and so Brad Treliving felt he was able to there. Clearly, he pulled the trigger. It's just those guys just don't come available very often. And I would suspect if somebody like that becomes available this season and there's the right circumstances where he may be a fit with the Leafs, you're gonna have to take a long look at that. I don't know. I suspect the way trades have kind of gone recently that you might be paying more than a first and 2 seconds. But
I would think so too.
Yeah, a lot of factors.
Yeah, but the point is, and why we went through these trades, is that now the Maple Leafs have a general manager who has experience making some blockbuster moves when his back was against the wall. And those are 2 clear-cut examples, both the Tkachuk trade and the Hamilton trade, where he didn't have a lot of leverage in the situation, but made out okay. So a lot of talk has been swirling about Brad Treliving and whether he's an upgrade on Kyle Dubas or a downgrade. I personally think, in terms of filling out the roster and finding talent and doing things like that, it might be a bit of a downgrade. But in terms of pulling off these blockbuster moves, we haven't seen Kyle Dubas pull anything like this yet at the NHL level. So maybe that's an upgrade.
And to be fair to Brad as well, as we can sit here and speculate as to who's the better general manager and who's done this and who's done that, but we're not comparing apples to apples here. Calgary's obviously got really good setup. They're in a Canadian market. They've got a great fan base. They make a lot of money. They spend to the cap. All of these things. So I'm by no means putting them into a category of a team in the league that doesn't make any money. We'll call them the Arizona Coyotes. But
no offense, though.
No disrespect.
No disrespect.
No disrespect, as Bruce Cassidy said.
That was fun.
But what is true is they also don't have the resources that MLSE makes available to the Leafs, and so Brad is coming into a team, into an organization where he's going to have more resources available to him than he's ever had before, both in terms of cash, in terms of personnel, and whatever else they've got going on behind the scenes there. I think where we're really going to have to evaluate is what does Brad do with the resources that he has, and similar to Kyle, he's going into another organization that is also similar. They've had a lot of success, 3 Stanley Cups in the last 14 years, make a lot of money, have a very loyal fan base, and all of these great things, but they don't have the resources that MLSE has. I don't know if Fenway Sports Group is going to change that and pour a lot more money into them, but Kyle may have, I don't know the inner workings there in Pittsburgh, but there may be a scenario where he, having the power that he has now, goes directly to ownership and says, I want this thing.
Yeah.
And maybe he's not handed a blank check.
Right.
So, both guys are going to be operating under slightly different situations than they previously were. So, I'm interested to see how they react and how they work in those scenarios. So, yeah.
Definitely.